Today, let's make a Valentine's wall hanging. So this is an amazing scrap buster project. So the first thing you need if you want to make this wall hanging is lots of different fabrics. So you're going to want maybe like pinks, reds. I did some light purples as well as some light blue. You could get away with so many different colors of quilting cotton that is pre-washed and then with multiple different widths and lengths. Now the best part is if you want even more detailed, there is a whole Etsy pattern that is available on my store that you can purchase if you would like to find out more widths and measurements. Next, you're going to want some sort of background material. So we're putting our heart, that applique is going to be going on some sort of cream or some sort of neutral color so that your heart will pop out. So you're going to want a yard of that. And then you're also going to want a yard of batting. There's so many different types of batting that you can get. You could do this natural type batting. You could also do like a polyfill, a low loft batting, whichever type of batting you have on hand or whatever you would like to use that you think that would be the best for this quilt for yourself. Next, you are going to want a quilting cotton. That'll be the back of your quilt. This could be just the fabric you have a lot of. You could use that neutral that you're using before, whatever you have on hand. Next, you're going to want some batting. I use this really pretty blue color for my batting. This is again a quilting cotton that then you can cut up into that 2-inch by, I think it's 154-inch strip. But again, all of that is listed on the Etsy pattern as well. Next, you're going to want some pins or some quilting clips. I found that pins are actually pretty helpful for this pattern. You're also going to want some scissors or a rotary cutter and a mat. You could do that too. And then we also are going to want a couple different types of thread. And the reason why I have two different ones here is the first one is just going to be the thread that you're using or piecing your pieces together with. And then you may also want a second type of thread for the quilting or that decorative sewing portion. Then the last thing you need is a hand needle. Now, if you want even more information, be sure to check the link in my description box, which is a link to the Etsy pattern. Use code HEART23 to get 30% off. So like I had mentioned before, this is a fantastic scrap buster project. I had lots of different reds and pinks and even some light purples that I used. So the first step was just going through and kind of organizing all the different fabrics I had, figuring out what colors I wanted to use, figuring out what materials, and all of these are quilting cottons that had been pre-washed. So I started to sort them into piles and fabrics that I had more of versus ones I had less of, just to figure out, like which colors that I really want to use for the pattern. Once I had that done, I started cutting out my strips. So in the actual Etsy pattern itself, I have a full breakdown of the different sizes I used, but if you are just trying to figure out your own way to do this, I used fabric strips that were in the width of 1.25 inches, 2.5 inches, and 3.5 inches. I kind of took a picture here. This video shows my iPad as I actually had drawn out what I was hoping to do, and I used it as a guide when I was building out my heart. Now the length of all those strips really varied, so it went anywhere from like 2 inches to close to 18 to 20 inches, so I could really have a bunch of different strips and sizes to put together for this unique shape. So once I had it all into the heart shape itself, this is what I ended up going with. So it had this really nice heart effect while still being a little abstract since it was all rectangles. Now there's two ways to start sewing this. You can either actually begin piecing all of your strips together to make long rows, or what I'm going to show you here is I started to do the pieces, so the rows that were just one piece of fabric each, I started to piece those together. And the way that I did this was I used my cutting mat, but you could definitely just use a ruler, and I put the piece of fabric, so the smaller piece of fabric, over top of the larger piece of fabric for that row, and then I centered it against that larger piece of fabric. And then I repeated this for each of those individual strips, so each of those rows. And I did this for all of the ones that were just those individual strips, so if it weren't connected. And then what I did for those larger strips, or the larger rows, was I had to join multiple pieces of fabric together. I again did with right sides together, started pinning and joining these along the short edge though. So to build out the length of our heart, you could say, you're going to be sewing against the long edge, but to build out the width of the heart, you're sewing against the short edge. So here is the whole group of fabrics together that I'm going to be sewing through. So here's an example of one of those long strips, and as you see, I sewed that short edge right there, and then I just pressed this open so it lay nice and flat. Then I just continued the process for the rest of the strips and then cut through them. For some of these, I did kind of do a daisy chain method where I was just sewing all of it together and I had to go through and cut it off. Now, as you can see here, these were 3 of the pieces that I had sewn at the bottom along the long edge so I could start to build out the length of the heart. Now it was time though, since I had the rest of the strips done, was to finish that process. So basically with right sides together, matching each of these strips together along the long edge so that I could build out the entire portion of the heart. So kind of going 2 strips at a time all the way up. And then when I get to the top where we have the little peaks for the heart, that will be something a little different. So again, the way that I did this was I matched up those 2 pieces of fabric with their right sides together, and then I sewed along the long edge, making sure that it was in the center. This will allow your heart to have a nice symmetrical shape. Once I had them pinned, I just took that straight seam for all the edges. Now when it got time for the top, as you can see, you have 2 different little peaks. So I measured so that it would have an even amount of fabric on either side as well as in the center, and then pinned the peaks and took a seam. Once I did that, my heart was actually complete as far as the full length. So now what it was time to do was press all of those seams nice and flat and open. So really be sure to take your time, make sure that the seams are getting nice and flat. And then on the edges, what you can see is I continued that seam allowance and folded it over and pressed that out as well. This will make it a lot easier when it comes time to do the applique, which is actually going to be our next step. So once your heart is completely pressed, you can get that background material you're going to be using and you're going to place your heart on top of it. So you're going to have your background material right side facing up, and then your heart is going to be the wrong side facing down so that you have both those right sides showing. And what we're going to be doing is pinning all the edges to the background material. And why we're doing this is so that we'll hold it in place when it comes time to do that applique. So this does take a lot of pins, but as you can see, we're just going to be sewing around all these edges. And when we're doing this, it's going to be using a zigzag stitch so that we clean up all the raw edges. So sewing machines vary, but you'll basically want to do that zigzag stitch, and you're going to have your needle so that it will be lined up on the outside of the fabric as well as going into the fabric itself. So be sure to backstitch here because it's very important, since this is what is holding our heart onto our background material. You don't want it to come undone. And then you're just going to very slowly keep stitching all the way around. So on those straight edges, you can go a little faster, but especially when you get to the corners, you want to make sure that it is all nice and smooth and that you aren't really able to see too much of that raw edge, as this is going to keep the little threads or any imperfections hidden. So now you may be wondering how to do the zigzag stitch when it comes to a corner. So as you can see, my needle is going into the white background material, and then it is going into the heart material. And I have this going back and forth multiple times, so the zigzag stitch. Now as I get closer and closer to the corner, I do slow down, as when you get to the corner, you want to be sure that you're still hitting the white or whatever background material you're using, and that you're not getting into the next strip of the heart. So as I get closer, I'm going to one more stitch. I'm going to back up a little bit for you here just so it's a little easier to see. But I'm going to do one more stitch so it's in that white material, and then I'm going to raise the presser foot on my machine so that I can turn my fabric 90 degrees. So now I am at the next edge, so there is that new pink strip, and I'm just going to continue with that zigzag stitch. So that will allow us to be able to get that nice clean corner look that we had, and then you just repeat this for each time. Now when it gets to the end, I did backstitch again, so that way I can make sure that this is nice and smooth and that I don't have to worry about it coming undone at any point. So very simple to do. You can use really just your normal presser foot as well, or you can use a zigzag foot. So here is what my heart looks like. The applique turned out so well on the fabric, and at this point it's going to be time to press out the background. You could definitely have done this first if you wanted to, and I did take a chance to just press out the heart again to make sure that it was all laying nice and flat and smooth. So now it is time to really begin building out the wall hanging. So you're going to have your back material as well as your batting, and you're going to cut them out the same size as the front portion of your quilt. So it's just very simple, making sure that you have your back, which you want the right side of the back facing down onto the floor or whatever surface you're using. Then you have your batting, and then you will have the heart material, so our heart front, facing up. You are able to see the right sides of both. Now because this is a larger quilt, I hand basted these 3 layers together, so when it came time for machine sewing, I wouldn't have to worry about them really moving too much. So I just took really, really large stitches and worked my way all the way through so that I made sure that they stayed together and weren't shifting. I think that this is a great step, but definitely optional if you feel that you have better control over your fabric. For the quilting portion, I did do a stitch in the ditch method for the heart itself, and then on the white background, I just did little swirls. You could definitely do whatever you would want with this though. There's so many different templates available, there's different patterns available, there's a lot that you can do with machine quilting, especially if you have like a long arm quilting machine, Or you could also hand quilt this. My grandmother does a lot of hand quilting and it turns out really, really well. The possibilities are sort of endless with this. Now it's time for me to go through and actually begin adding the bias tape. This is the last step and it was so exciting. As you can see, I started to pin this already, and one step I did want to point out, as I didn't go too in depth with this, is just how to do a corner for bias tape. The way that I do it, as I feel like this can come up a lot in question, is I put my pin at 45 degrees, so with my bias tape, with the right side of the bias tape facing the right side of my quilt. And you know, it's really important to make sure that the pin is nice and at that 45-degree angle, as it just makes the corner look a little sharper when it comes time to actually sewing this up. Then I fold my bias tape over the pin so that it's kind of at an angle, and then I fold it over one more time, except this time that fold is at a nice straight line. And you can pin this again, and then this is going to hold it in place. And then as we go through, we will begin actually sewing that, and I'll show you how to sew it so that you get that nice corner as well when it comes time for the bias tape. So now for sewing the bias tape, I sew in that crease that was made. But when it comes time for the corner, I sew all the way down to wherever that pin is. So here's where my pin currently is. I can feel it. You could definitely have added a pin on this side if you would like as well, just to be extra sure. But I keep sewing very, very slowly until I get to that pin. And then I'm going to back stitch, so this way it holds that stitch. I don't have to worry about it ever coming out or unraveling. And then I'm going to sew it a little bit again. And then I'm going to cut the thread so that this kind of ends the stitch completely. So now I'm going to put my bias tape back under, so the sewing machine, and I'm going to start sewing it again where that crease is. I'm going to get as close as I can to where that pin was, and I'm just going to take that straight stitch all the way through. Now I am going to back tack since I am starting a new stitch, and then I'm just going to keep going straight, and this is going to give us a nice corner when it comes time to folding this over. Now the other part that I always have questions about when I am doing bias tape is how do you finish? So I'm going to show you how I do it. I know there's lots of different ways you can do this, but let's say you have your two ends of your bias tape and you need them to come together. I trim wherever it is, that extra fabric, and then I just take a straight seam through it as well as a straight seam to connect those two pieces. I know that there's multiple different ways for how you can finish off your bias tape, but that's just one way that I do it, and I found that it works really well for quilts. Now is the long and tedious part. I know that some people do go through and machine stitch their bias tape on. I really like the look of hand stitching it. It makes it look really nice and you kind of get this nice invisible stitch. Also, like I mentioned earlier, my grandmother hand quilts her quilts, and I find that this is just like a nice little homage or touch back to her, that even though I didn't hand quilt all of the patterns on it, I am hand stitching something on this quilt. And that's very similar to how she also does her quilts. So I think it's a nice touch and I kind of enjoy doing it. So here's what our corner looks like when I talked about having that nice and smooth corner. So now it is time for me to just hand sew this down as well. And then our quilt is basically complete. We are there. So if you enjoyed this, if you would like the pattern, be sure to check out my Etsy shop. Use code HEART23 to get 30% off if you want more detailed instructions. If you do make this quilt, let me know. Be sure to tag me on Instagram at SewEmyDesigns. Tell me in the comments what you want to see next, and thanks for watching.